Heartbreak is not merely a wound of the heart, but a particular way the mind learns to measure the world. It is the felt gap between longing and reality, the ache that arises when what we crave sits beside what cannot be. It is the weight of finitude pressing on every choice, a reminder that our days are bounded, our loves mortal, our projects finite in their reach. And yet heartbreak also carries a demand. To seek meaning within the limits, to find a way to stand under the weight without surrendering to it. In this section, we will travel through that problem from its oldest consolations to its most acute modern diagnoses, tracing how different thinkers have framed the riddle of sorrow, how they have proposed to bear it, and how their thought might become a practice in living through heartbreak rather than merely surviving it. To begin, we should name heartbreak in its fullest sense. It is not simply a feeling of sadness that arrives when a loved one dies or a dream falters. It is the sense of a rift between what could be and what is, a felt disruption of the ordinary continuity of life that makes us question not only our plans, but the very shape of our identities. It asks, what is the good life when the world refuses to keep its promises? Where does meaning reside when the horizon seems to recede, or when the future refuses to yield the fruit we expected? And finally, heartbreak presses this question into the present. How should I live now, this day, in the face of a future that may not give me what I hoped for? To scaffold that inquiry historically is to see how cultures have attempted to bear human fragility. In pre-modern times, consolation centers were communal and theological, a providential order, a plan beyond the furthest reach of our perception, an afterlife where wounds might be healed. In that sense, heartbreak could be interpreted within a larger story of fate or divine pedagogy, where suffering is not meaningless but meaningful for its role in the world's moral economy. As modernity arrives with its new claims about autonomy, science, and the fragility of social bonds, the problem intensifies in a different key. The consolations of the past, reward and punishment, sin and salvation, a fate ordered by a benevolent will, lose their unquestioned authority. The result is disillusionment, a sense that life can be both intensely meaningful and inexplicably unjust at once. Yet within disillusionment there remains a stubborn question: if the old theodicies fail, what replaces them? If longing persists while reality disappoints, what should the human stance be towards suffering, loss, and the unyielding limits of life? We begin with a central figure who makes both the universality and the intensity of heartbreak unignorable. Arthur Schopenhauer, in his central claim, the world is not a benevolent stage but a drama organized by the will, a blind, ceaseless striving that never achieves satisfaction. The world is representation to the mind, but beneath that representation lies a more stubborn reality, the will. The will to live, to possess, to be complete, to overcome. The will to have the object we desire and the object's inevitable withdrawal into time's current. In Schopenhauer, suffering is not an occasional intruder, but the constitutive texture of existence. The world for him is saturated by dissatisfaction. Desire arises, produces pain, and is extinguished only momentarily by gratification, which then gives way to the next appetite, the next unmet hunger. The magnitude of this claim is not a cold theoretical theorem, but a diagnosis that points to heartbreak as the universal condition. If life is a theater of desires that forever outpace their satisfaction, heartbreak becomes not a personal misfortune, but a phenomenology of life itself. This is not to say one should resign to despair. Schopenhauer also points to a possible quietus, a temporary release from the will through aesthetic contemplation, compassion, and ascetic practice. In the aesthetic moment, the pure perception of art or nature, the will recedes. One experiences the world without the compulsions that would otherwise drive the body into unsatisfied striving. Yet the remedy is delicate and precarious. It is not a triumph over suffering by force of will, but a withdrawal from the will's suction, a momentary respite rather than a permanent cure. Consider heartbreak through Schopenhauer's lens. The death of a loved one, a bearable ache that lingers because the world no longer appears in the same way. When a beloved departs, the demand remains for meaning, but the meaning cannot be simply found in the continuity of life as it was. Schopenhauer would remind us that the will's demands do not vanish with death, rather the demand is reframed. The lover's longing was a form of will in action, and its cessation does not abolish desire, it transforms it. The question becomes, how might one respond to the gap without feeding it with new, restless wants that will simply accrue new forms of pain? One path, in Schopenhauer's scheme, is to train the attention toward forms of beauty that can quiet the will for a time. The aesthetic moment, where the observer becomes merely aware of what is, offers a reprieve, a space in which the self does not have to defend or project itself, where the mind can rest from the endless drive to possess. This is not a denial of loss, but a way of meeting it with a form of freedom, a pocket of silence in which one can endure without surrendering the core sense of being. Beyond the aesthetic, Schopenhauer also points toward compassion as a moral counterweight to heartbreak. If the will is the source of suffering, perhaps we can mitigate that suffering by turning outward, by recognizing in others' pain a reflection of our own. The more we empathize, the less the world appears as a stage on which our own needs must be gratified. Instead, we see a shared beingness that invites gentleness and restraint. Compassion, then, is not merely a sentimental response. It is a disciplined stance that reduces the will's hold by widening the field of concern. In that way, heartbreak becomes an occasion for ethical transformation, a shift from a self-centered theater of desire to a relational, morally attentive mode of living. Schopenhauer's diagnosis is bleak, but his prescriptions offer a double release. An invitation to a contemplative receptivity and a practice of compassion that can quell the ego's frantic demand for the world to bend to one's private sorrow. But heartbreak is also a crucible for the birth of new meanings, a space in which the tests of suffering can rearrange the self and its values. Enter Soren Kierkegaard, who writes from the vertigo of modern freedom and the dread that accompanies it. For Kierkegaard, anxiety, what he often calls angst or dread, is not merely a symptom to be cured but a fundamental structure of human existence. It arises from a sense that the self stands at a precipice before possibilities proliferate and the self must choose, and by choosing, define itself. Anxiety, in his view, is the dizziness that accompanies freedom. It discloses the responsibility of choice and the solitude of authentic commitment. The modern subject is asked to leap, not to escape anxiety, but to inhabit it in a way that makes life meaningful despite the risk. The leap of faith is not a reckless jump, but a deliberate, uncertain commitment in the face of an absurd or opaque horizon. The leap is often misread as a mere acceptance of religious belief, but for Kierkegaard, it is a choice to adopt a stance that cannot be fully justified by universal reason. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard makes use of the story of Abraham to illustrate the paradox. A command that seems to contradict ethical norms, a decision that must be taken without the stabilizing assurances of the crowd. The leap, then, is not a flight from anxiety, but a transmutation of it into moral direction. To embrace heartbreak in Kierkegaard's sense is to allow the vertigo of possibility to push one toward a more genuine form of commitment, a faith that is not a retreat from doubt but a response to it. Two things emerge from Kierkegaard that are especially relevant to heartbreak. First, the sense that meaning is not given but chosen. That is, the world's meaning is not a pre-existing map, but a project one must undertake in the face of radical uncertainty. Heartbreak then becomes a test of will and a test of seriousness. What commitments will you hold even when the ground seems uncertain? The second is the idea that dread and faith are tied together in the formation of selfhood. The person who confronts heartbreak is given a chance to become something more than a mere reaction to circumstance. Through dread, the self is formed. Through a courageous, if imperfect, commitment, the individual can find a way to bear sorrow into a life that remains open to possibility. This is not a naive optimism, but a form of existential courage that acknowledges the limits of reason, while insisting that human beings can inhabit their limits with integrity. Yet if Schopenhauer emphasizes the universal suffering built into the fabric of the will, and Kierkegaard insists that the self must take responsibility for meaning in the face of dread, another historical voice invites a more skeptical or humorous stance toward death and uncertainty. Michel de Montaigne, writing amidst illness and the constant proximity of mortality in Renaissance humanist life, offers a different tempo, a humanist skepticism that carries a gentle humor into the solemn questions. Montaigne's essays are a laboratory of doubts, a series of self-scrutinies that test the stubborn claims we make about ourselves, about knowledge, and about the value we place on human life. He writes with a tone of frank, practical philosophy, a style that treats death not as a metaphysical problem to be solved, but as a neighbor to be considered with equanimity. He asks, what is it to know? How certain can we be about anything? How do we live well knowing that even our best reasons for living may be undermined by the stubborn fact of mortality? The humor in Montaigne is not escape but a shield against the arrogance of certainty. It is as if he invites the reader to accompany him in a long, intimate conversation with mortality, where skepticism becomes a form of companionship rather than a denial of seriousness. To bring Montaigne into the present, imagine him at his desk during a bout of illness, the room thick with the scent of herbs, the clock ticking with a peculiar patience, the body a frail instrument that still desires to think, to write, to connect. He would not pretend that pain is nothing or that death is a distant rumor. Rather, he would treat the body's limits as a reliable instructor, showing that wisdom does not require invulnerability but a certain restraint, humor, and openness to contingency. He might insist that uncertainty is the condition of the human mind, and that to pretend certainty would be a sort of self-deception more painful than the sickness. In his essays, Montaigne stages a dialogue with himself that has the quality of a conversation with the entire human race. The reader encounters Montaigne's insistence on the fallibility of human judgment, his willingness to mock pretensions to absolute knowledge, and his insistence that uncertainty should not paralyze living, but qualify it with humility and wit. In that sense, heartbreak, for Montaigne, is not an anomaly but a regular condition of human life, a reminder that we should not pretend to master mortality, but to live with it with honesty and a quiet, shared humanity. The third historical figure we should anchor our meditation in is Albert Camus, whose life and work in colonial Algeria provides a stark example of how political pressure and personal crisis intersect with questions of meaning. Camus writes with the sensibility of a modern intellectual who cannot escape the political tremor of his time. He faces a world that is not simply governed by intimate loss, but by the absurd structure of a society in which the human craving for justice collides with the silence of the world and the stubborn opposition of circumstance. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus offers a rigorous diagnosis. The absurd arises where human longing for clarity collides with an indifferent cosmos. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. And in that confrontation he offers a program of revolt, a refusal to surrender to nihilism or to pretend that the world has given us a simple, final meaning. The revolt is not a denial of heartbreak but a transformation of it. To continue living with the knowledge of the world's indifference, to pursue acts of solidarity, justice, and honest living even when those acts do not guarantee success or certainty. The famous line, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart," captures a response to heartbreak that refuses to turn away from the void, but instead asserts the value of striving. Camus' Algeria is not a mere backdrop. It reveals how political life can intensify questions of meaning, how the personal and the political are intertwined, and how a person whose life is engaged with both intimate love and public obligation might learn to endure without false comfort. A further historical vignette comes from Kierkegaard's own environment, his solitary Copenhagen, where the weather and the city's quiet, the customs of the pious burgher life, and his own introspective fever all converged to shape a temperament that was at once religious and intensely ethical. Kierkegaard's meditations on dread arise in a place where social life reaffirms certain certainties while inward life tests them. The solitary student who reads and writes and contends with the pressures of family, faith, and vocation embodies the tension between communal value systems and the personal demand to choose, to commit, to risk. In that sense, his life is a lived laboratory for how heartbreak might function as a spur to existential fidelity, rather than simply as a psychic condition to endure. The sense of dread, when experienced in such a setting, can become a compass pointing toward an ethical and religious direction that is chosen rather than imposed. The leap of faith becomes a way of binding the inward and outward demands of life, a way to translate anxiety into a decision that remains faithful to a chosen path even when the path itself seems uncertain. To test these positions against the two concrete anchors that often structure long-form exploration, let us consider two situations that recur across literature and lived experience. The first is the death of a loved one and the long, looping process of grieving. It is a patient, repetitive business, a grief that can emerge in waves, that resists quick closure, that insists on returning to memory as a way of reweaving a damaged sense of belonging. The second is a stalled creative project or life aim that refuses to yield an obvious meaning, where the work remains undone, the dream unresolved, and the question of worth lingers as a persistent rumor in the soul. These two anchors ground a theory of heartbreak in the actualities of life, reminding us that heartbreak is not abstract thought but an experiential discipline, a way of learning to live with questions that may not have definitive answers. In the case of death, the grief process can loop because the presence of the beloved persists as a memory that the present cannot fully rewrite. The living are asked to reconcile the absence with the desire for continuity, to construct a meaning that includes a void that cannot be filled by repetition or replacement. Schopenhauer's injunction to contemplate beauty and detach from the will offers a temporary pedagogy. Seek a form of quiet perception that allows the mind to rest from the tyranny of desire. The idea is not to erase the sense of loss, but to reorient one's attention away from the fight to regain what was lost and toward a more spacious way of being in which memory and present life coexist. The challenge is to avoid a retreat into mere stoic endurance that freezes the heart and instead to cultivate compassion for oneself and others who suffer. This is where Kierkegaard's emphasis on choice and commitment becomes invaluable. Grief invites a deeply personal decision. Will one allow memory to become a living force that guides new commitments, or will one allow despair to hollow out the future? The leap for the bereaved is not a leap away from sorrow, but a leap toward a form of life in which sorrow remains but does not govern every action. For Camus, grief in the modern world is filtered through the recognition that the universe does not provide an obvious moral justification for the pain we suffer, and that human solidarity in the face of this fact becomes a source of meaning in its own right. The response is not to pretend that suffering has a simple explanation or to demand universal narratives that absolve private sorrow, but to pursue acts of justice, care, and solidarity that give life a direction even when the cosmos refuses to do so. The phenomenology of sorrow in Camus's sense is the impetus to revolt, to refuse despair, to continue to ask questions, to act as if a different order of meaning is possible because we insist upon it through our choices. When we turn to the second anchor, the stalled creative project or life aim, the problem becomes more subtle. The longing here is for a future that cannot be guaranteed by the present, a future that would render the present meaningful if only the project could complete itself or the dream could be realized. The sense of circularity and delay is a common form of heartbreak. The project is almost there, the breakthrough remains elusive, and every fresh attempt seems to reveal a new limit rather than a new horizon. Schopenhauer would suggest again a redirection of energy, perhaps toward a form of aesthetic engagement that does not require completion in order to yield a moment of meaning, a return to a state where perception can occur without the pressure of fulfillment. The longing for a completed project is itself a form of desire. The key is to learn to appreciate the process, the small acts of creation that form a continuous stream rather than a single final product. Here too, Kierkegaard's insistence on the seriousness of commitment can be helpful. The stalled project may compel us to re-examine our vocation and our values. Is the project a true expression of our chosen self or something else, perhaps a defense against the possibility of failure in other, more vulnerable aspects of life? The leap of faith may lie in committing to a direction even when the outcome remains uncertain, in choosing to create in a way that remains faithful to the self's inner demands, even as the external result stays elusive. To ground these reflections in primary sources is to hear the voices of the thinkers who first gave the problem its shape. Let us turn to some guiding passages that illuminate how these figures thought about heartbreak, pain, and meaning. From Epictetus, we have a practical maxim that refuses to yield to self-pity. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. This is not a how-to for every circumstance, but a call to ethical agency within the limits that life imposes. If heartbreak comes, the question becomes not whether the pain will disappear, but how the mind will respond in its presence. The Stoic stance does not demand a stoic mask of indifference. It invites a form of freedom, freedom to choose one's attitude towards suffering, to decide what the self will allow the item of sorrow to do to it. From Marcus Aurelius, we have the line that anchors a certain resilience in the face of obstacles. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. This sentence, in its stark clarity, reframes heartbreak as an opportunity to reconfigure our path rather than as a catastrophe that destroys the future. When the beloved is gone, when a project stalls, when life's promises falter, the obstacle can become the texture of a new course. The mind that accepts the obstacle as part of the road discovers a way forward that did not exist before. The heart does not disappear, it is redirected into the requirements of action that are tempered by reality. From Aristotle, the theory of tragedy and catharsis offers a different lens for heartbreak, one that investigates the social and ethical dimensions of suffering. Tragedy, as Aristotle says, is an imitation of a serious action, and the emotion it stirs, pity and fear, produces a purification, a catharsis within the audience. Heartbreak in this sense is not merely private pain, but a possible site of community transformation. The witnessing of sorrow in others, the staging of sorrow in art, can yield a shared understanding that allows a community to endure sorrow without dissolving into it. The ruin of a life project can be read as a case study in how a story might be reimagined, so that its moral and emotional gravity can still contribute to a larger, public sense of meaning. The catharsis that Aristotle describes is not a palliative. It is a social and ethical cultivation that invites the audience to experience their own vulnerability and, in experiencing it, to become more compassionate and more capable of bearing the burdens of others. In addition to these classical and modern sources, we can turn to the broader phenomenology of emotion and the cross-cultural conversation about suffering and meaning. A cross-cultural comparison with Buddhist ideas about dukkha, or suffering, and the path of mindful acceptance can show how different traditions approach a central problem. The recognition that life is unsatisfactory in certain essential ways, and that the coping strategies we choose can either intensify the pain or reframe it in a way that allows for a more deliberate living. The Buddhist emphasis on mindful acceptance and compassionate action invites a turn away from the compulsion to rewrite reality toward a patient, ethical engagement with reality. The prayer in this tradition is not for the world to change to fit our desires, but for the mind to cultivate a form of acceptance that keeps the heart open to others and to life's mystery. The broader cross-section of thinkers also includes the Stoics we have already mentioned, but also Spinoza, who offers a more systematized account of how to live with the passions. Spinoza's claim that the mind can be strengthened by understanding necessity and by transforming the passive experiences of pain into active, rational responses is a powerful counterweight to despair. The path he sketches, understanding the causes of one's passions, aligning one's will with what is, and cultivating a form of joy that arises from freedom rather than mere pleasure, offers a robust alternative to resignation. The idea that freedom lies in the intellect's understanding of necessity and in the ethical handling of one's passions provides a framework within which heartbreak can function as a catalyst for a form of moral and intellectual maturity, rather than as an irresistible force of withdrawal. In addition to the philosophical and moral frameworks, there are practical exercises that can support a calm, reflective pace during these explorations. If we want to move from mere theory to lived practice, we might invite the viewer to a set of reflective activities designed to sustain balance while traversing the hard questions. First, close textual readings of primary sources. If possible, take a single passage from Montaigne's essays, Camus's The Myth of Sisyphus, and Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and read them aloud slowly, letting the cadence of the sentences guide your breath. Pay attention to how the sentences model a stance toward uncertainty and suffering. Note where the author resists easy answers and where they offer a path to action rather than resignation. If you can, compare how the same theme, anxiety, mortality, meaning, appears in the different passages and ask what each author thinks is the proper form of response to heartbreak. Second, cross-cultural comparisons. Read a short selection from a Buddhist text about dukkha or compassion, and a short passage from a Stoic or Spinoza-informed guide to the management of passions. Notice what each tradition treats as the core need. Is it independence from suffering, or a responsible engagement with it, or a disciplined cultivation of the mind? Reflect on how these approaches could complement one another in a personal practice. Third, practical reflective exercises. Journaling prompts short rituals and daily practices that keep a calm, reflective pace even when heartbreak intrudes. Journaling prompts 1. Write about a recent moment of heartbreak as a narrative, not a report of feeling. What did you want that you could not have? What did you fear losing besides the object of desire? How did your body respond to the feeling? What did you learn about yourself in the midst of that pain? 2. Write a scene in which you meet your future self after a year of heartbreak. What wisdom or restraint does that future self offer in answer to today's pain? 3. Write a short dialogue between you and your longing, where you ask it what it wants, and it responds with a request that you can fulfill in the coming week. 4. Write about a time when you observed someone else's heartbreak and felt moved to respond. What did that response teach you about your own needs and limits? Short rituals that anchor reflective states. 1. A 5-minute daily contemplation on impermanence. Sit in a quiet space, observe thoughts as passing events, and bring attention to the breath as a steady, renewing presence. 2. A weekly ritual of gratitude that balances the ache of longing with recognition of small acts of care, memory kept, and shared moments. 3. A compassionate action ritual. Reach out to someone who may be suffering, perform a practical act of kindness, and reflect on how care for the other changes one's own sense of meaning. A calm, reflective pace. 1. The practice of pausing before speaking or acting in moments of heartache, giving the mind time to choose a response rather than reacting in the heat of feeling. 2. The cultivation of listening to the sorrow within oneself, listening to the sorrow in others, and listening to the world's quiet insistence that life is still meaningful in ways that may be different from those one expected. We should recall that the problem of heartbreak is not solved by glib optimism or by a retreat into resignation. The aim is to cultivate a form of living that can hold sorrow in a larger sense of purpose, and to do so with humility about one's own limits and with a generous regard for others who suffer. The paths laid out by Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Montaigne, and Camus illuminate different ways in which meaning can be approached in the face of finitude and longing. Each thinker offers a different technique, a different method for enduring sorrow and for converting some of its energy into a form of living that remains true to the dignity of human beings. We should not forget the counterarguments that propose a different route. Two robust counterarguments deserve particular attention because they remind us that the problem of heartbreak is not uniquely the domain of a single philosophical tradition, and that there is more than one way to think about tranquility and freedom in the face of pain. First, Stoicism and Spinoza offer durable strategies for tranquility in the face of pain and can reframe heartbreak as a domain for freedom, not merely suffering. The Stoics, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, teach that the key to peace lies in distinguishing what we can control from what we cannot, and in training the will to align itself with reality rather than resist it. The famous Epictetus line about reactions remains a core instrument in the toolkit. We do not get to choose every circumstance, but we can choose how we respond to it. The Stoic path is not a denial of pain, but a discipline that prevents pain from becoming pain for the soul. The practical consequence is a form of resilience that is not passive but active and principled. It does not erase heartbreak, but reframes it within a life oriented by virtue and rational order rather than by the merely personal craving. Spinoza contributes a more metaphysical account of the same question. If the mind can be freed from the unproductive passions by understanding the causal network that produces them, heartbreak transforms into a field for the exercise of reason. The process by which the mind comes to understand the necessity of certain conditions can turn the passion into knowledge, and knowledge, in turn, can turn pain into a component of a broader, more deeply integrated life. In Spinoza's frame, happiness is not the absence of pain, but the alignment of one's life with the necessary order of nature, a life governed by rational understanding and ethical action. The implication for heartbreak is that sorrow can become part of a larger rational order in which one acts with integrity and sympathy toward others, thus realizing freedom not as liberation from all constraints, but as a disciplined, enlightened mastery of one's affections. The second robust counterargument points to traditions that stress social care and solidarity as the route to transforming suffering rather than enduring it in isolation. This position argues that heartbreak can be transformed when it is redirected from self-absorption toward community, care, and social action. The reasoning here is not that pain disappears, but that meaning is created through acts of generosity, justice, and mutual support. Aristotle's idea of tragedy, extended from the theater to everyday life, suggests that witnessing and participating in the sorrow of others can foster a shared sense of meaning. If we can bear witness to each other's pain and act to alleviate it in practical, shared ways, our own heartbreak becomes a channel for moral energy that can heal not only the self but the social world around us. These counterarguments do not cancel the insights of Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Montaigne, or Camus. Rather, they broaden the field of possible responses to heartbreak. They remind us that we do not live in a single philosophical universe, but in a plural one in which different strains of thought offer different methods for living well with sorrow. The Stoic, the Spinoza-influenced thinker, the Aristotelian reader of tragedy, and the Buddhist all contribute to a map of practical strategies for bearing heartbreak that can complement and enrich the more existential or metaphysical approaches. Each path has its own demands and its own risks, and the best approach may even be to cultivate a personal repertoire that includes elements of each, according to the situations of life, the temperament of the person, and the particular texture of the heartbreak at hand. To bring this exploration into a more integrative frame, we can cross-reference other frameworks and thinkers for deeper depth. The Stoics offer a robust system. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius are primary anchors, whose claims about the primacy of attitude and the necessity of rational agency can be juxtaposed with Buddhist ideas about natural suffering and mindful acceptance. Aristotle's theory of tragedy provides a lens for considering the social dimension of heartbreak and the cathartic function of art and shared narrative. Phenomenology offers insights into the lived texture of emotion. How heartbreak feels as a lived body state, how the senses and the imagination work together to shape the experience of longing, loss, and the search for meaning. In modern Europe and America, Camus's existential realist framework gives a third axis. Recognizing the absurd, choosing to revolt, and discovering meaning through solidarity and courageous action rather than through metaphysical guarantees. The cross-reference to Eastern philosophies of renunciation and compassion offers further depth. The renunciation of attachment, the cultivation of compassion for others, and the acceptance of suffering as part of life's path are not only Buddhist or Hindu concerns, but concerns that have parallels in many religious and philosophical traditions. In shaping and delivering this material for a long-form video, it is essential to guide the audience toward concrete steps of expansion and practical reflection. The core texts Montaigne, Camus, Kierkegaard offer rich, non-syllabus-like readings that reward careful, patient engagement. Close textual readings of primary sources, reading Montaigne's essays, Camus's Myth of Sisyphus, Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, provide a living sense of how these authors think in their own voices, beyond secondary interpretations. Cross-cultural comparisons with Eastern renunciation and compassion offer a broader canvas for interpretation, and practical exercises, journaling prompts, rituals, and reflective practices help cultivate the contemplative pace that a section like this ought to have. The goal is not to solve heartbreak, but to cultivate a practice of mind and life that can hold sorrow with honesty, curiosity, and ethical seriousness. Let me invite you to carry forward specific moments of the narrative as you study and reflect. When you read Schopenhauer, notice how the world's suffering appears not as something to be solved, but as the condition that invites a certain kind of quiet, patient perception, the aesthetic stance that can give the mind a brief respite from the will's demands. When you read Kierkegaard, listen for the music of anxiety and the sense that meaning is not found by solving existence, but by choosing a direction amid the vertigo of possibilities. When you read Montaigne, attend to the humor and self-scrutiny that lighten the weight of mortality without denying its significance. When you read Camus, listen for the insistence that rebellion and solidarity can make life morally serious even in the face of an indifferent cosmos. And in your own life, practice a form of slow, deliberate engagement with heartbreak. Read a primary text aloud, reflect on a passage, and ask, what does this suggest about my own heartbreak? Which passages resonate most, and why? What would it mean to bring in a Stoic or Spinoza-inspired approach to a current moment of sorrow? How might mindful acceptance and compassionate action be integrated into a personal plan for dealing with grief or stalled aspiration? What does this mean for my daily routine, my relationships, and my commitments to others? To recapitulate the core narrative we have explored here, heartbreak is a condition that exposes the limits of longing, the finitude of human life, and the demand for meaning in a world that often withholds easy answers. From Schopenhauer, we learn that the world's fundamental texture is driven by the will and that suffering lies at the heart of life. From Kierkegaard, we learn that meaning must be chosen in the face of existential dread, and that a leap of faith may reorient a life toward a direction that is not guaranteed by reason alone. From Montaigne, we learn that skepticism and humor can be a form of moral honesty about mortality, an antidote to the arrogance of certainty, and a way to live with questions rather than to pretend they are not there. From Camus, we learn that the absurd is a diagnostic of modern life, and that revolt, through solidarity, care, and purposeful action, gives an answer that is at once practical and morally serious. In the practical arena, we test these ideas in two anchors, the grief of losing a loved one and the frustration of a stalled creative dream. In both cases, heartbreak is not only an emotion to endure but a philosophical occasion to cultivate attention, choice, and care. In the end, the problem of heartbreak may not yield a single, definitive solution, but it can yield a form of living that treats sorrow as a serious teacher and as a call to a more attentive, ethically engaged, and creatively adventurous life. As we close this segment, consider the three anecdotes that ground this inquiry: Montaigne's illness and proximity to death during the Renaissance, Camus's life in colonial Algeria, where political pressure intersects with daily life and personal crisis, Kierkegaard's solitary Copenhagen, and the way dread shapes religious and ethical direction. In each case, we see heartbreak not simply as a private ache, but as a historical and existential prompt to reimagine how to live with limits, how to seek meaning in the face of finitude, and how to cultivate a quiet, compassionate courage in the midst of a world that does not always bend to our desires. Two more words before we move on. First, a reminder that hearts can break in many ways, through loss, through delay, through disillusionment, through the mere sense that time is not on our side. The aim of this exploration is not to erase that ache, but to orient it toward a patient, ethical, and creative life. Second, a note about scale. We have walked through a wide landscape. Individual sorrow, philosophical theories, cultural traditions, and practical disciplines. The hope is that by tracing these lines, you will sense a practical thread that you can weave into your own life, an orientation towards suffering that is not a defense against pain nor an invitation to commodify it, but a careful, generous, and courageous stance toward the truth of heartbreak and the ongoing search for meaning in a finite world. If you carry these reflections with you, you may discover that heartbreak, however hard, can also be a teacher who asks you to be honest about limits and brave enough to seek what good might still be found within them. Pain presses in when the world feels indifferent, as if the universe itself has learned to ignore our private weather. The 2 hours of heartbreak we carry inside us are not just personal history, they are a pressure gauge for meaning. When we stare into a silent cosmos and hear only the echo of our own breaths, philosophy steps in not as a luxury but as a practical stance. It asks, what do you do with a universe that offers no obvious answer to the question, why am I here? The absurd, Camus insists, is not a metaphysical abyss so wide that we cannot cross it. It is the recognition that the cosmos does not hand us a final justification for our longing. The leap, Kierkegaard argues, is not a dance of escape but a costly decision, a financing of meaning through risk. The will to live, in Nietzsche's language, is not a passive stamina but a creative project, an act of affirming life even as it repeats its trials. In this section we will walk through these claims with care, the careful exegesis of Camus's Sisyphus as an absurd hero who embraces revolt through continuous ascent, Kierkegaard's insistence on the conscience-creating risk of choosing a path of faith in a hostile or indifferent cosmos, and Nietzsche's eternal recurrence as a radical call to affirm life even in the face of repetition. And as we move, we will ground theory in concrete, heartbroken reality. A writer who keeps shaping words after a heartbreak, a musician who forges new form from repeated rejection. Then we will braid historical texture, the Algerian streets where Camus thought through political urgency, the Copenhagen of Kierkegaard's self-scrutiny, Nietzsche's years of cultivating a philosophy born of struggle, and we will listen for what these momentous lives offer to our own. We begin with the absurd in Camus's portrait of the Sisyphus that can carry us forward rather than bog us down. Camus does not pretend that the world's silence is magically filled by a cosmic wink or a comforting sign. He names the condition plainly, the sensation that life does not in itself provide a rational justification for enduring pain or pursuing meaning through suffering. The absurd for Camus is the collision between our demand for significance and the indifferent universe that cannot supply it from the outside. And the famous response, what Camus calls the revolt, is not a rejection of meaning but a refusal to surrender to it as a mere pretext or a simple consolation. The revolt is perpetual, a continuous ascent toward meaning, even when all signs insist that the ascent must end in futility. This is not a grim resignation, nor is it a naive optimism. It is a stance, the will to carry on, to shape a life by choosing the stance of meaning in the face of nothingness. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus gives us a figure who embodies the absurdity of human life while also showing us how to live within its structure. Sisyphus is cursed to push a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll down again, endlessly. The image is brutal in its repetition, something like a daily heartbreak repeated across eternity. And yet Camus offers a counterintuitive twist. The moment of deciding what to do with that punishment is where freedom resides. The crucial line, the one that travelers in philosophy carry with them, is that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. It is not the summit, it is the ascent. The meaning arises not from the hope that the boulder will never roll back or that the hill will finally be conquered, but from the act of choosing to climb again each morning, again after every fall. And in that decision, Camus allows one more item of consolation, that quiet, almost defiant dignity. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The happiness Camus gestures toward is not happiness in a conventional sense. It is the contentment that comes from fidelity to the task, from turning the endless repetition into a personal project of meaning-making despite the odds. To hear Camus in his own right, we should attend to how he writes about revolt. Revolt is not a violent gesture toward a higher power. It is a mental and moral posture that refuses to grant the absurd the last word. Revolt keeps our attention on the present moment, the very act of living, so that life is not dissolved into despair, nor left to drift into mechanical resignation. The revolt is a daily decision to live with the tension between longing for a rational justification and the stubborn reality that such justification does not appear. It is a discipline of consciousness, a training in fidelity. Fidelity to the tasks of living that give shape to a life, even when those tasks arise from heartbreak, even when the meaning seems to be thinning out. Camus's absurd hero does not escape. He or she turns the escape into a self-respecting project, an ascent in the face of gravity, a determination to continue shaping value, a willingness to labor at the world's own terms. Camus's analytic horizon is reinforced by a concrete historical moment. Camus's years in Algeria, where colonial politics, hunger for justice, and existential questions intersected in a drama of intellect versus power. He did not write about meaning in a vacuum. He lived and wrote at a time when the human cost of political violence and social escalation forced philosophy to leave the armchair and show up in the streets, in the newspapers, in debates with public figures who attempted to reconcile moral conviction with political reality. To read Camus here is to see the absurd as not only a metaphysical problem, but a lived problem. How do we proceed when the political world refuses to provide a neat meaning for human suffering? And how does the hero of revolt differ from the naive hero who simply refuses to acknowledge pain? Camus gives us a more restrained heroism, one that acknowledges pain and still chooses to climb. Let us take a moment to anchor two real-world pathways that Camus's portrait of revolt illuminates. The first is the writer or artist who continues to labor after heartbreak. In the wake of heartbreak, the mind often feels reluctant and the body heavy. The heart's tempo becomes a metronome of doubt, yet the writer's or composer's instrument, the mind, still has something to offer the world. The second path is the musician or artist who crafts art despite repeated rejection and failure. The painful pattern of rejection sharpens the eye for what matters, and in the act of turning pain into form, the artist creates something that endures beyond the private wound. In both cases, the work becomes not a cure for the pain, but a way of living with it, of letting it inform the shape and meaning of the life one continues to inhabit. Let us now move to Kierkegaard and the leap of faith. Where Camus teaches us to revolt within the absurd, Kierkegaard asks us to take a different risk, to make a commitment to meaning through a choice that transcends what can be proved or demonstrated by universal reasoning. The leap of faith is not a leap into irrationalism or credulous contrivance. It is a decision that proceeds under the sign of radical subjectivity. It is a decision that carries the conscience into the arena of what matters most to the self. The commitment to a form of life that makes sense for one person as a whole, even when the world around is indifferent or hostile. Kierkegaard's insistence here is that the path toward meaning is not a matter of accumulation of evidence. It is a matter of choosing a story about one's life that is worth living, despite the risk of error, despite the possibility of moral failure, despite the cosmos refusing to provide a settled solution. To grasp Kierkegaard's stance, we can recall the famous line that frames his philosophy of life as a series of passionate, risky choices. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. This paradox is central to the existential accounting that the Danish thinker offers. To understand life is to look back across the arc of one's choices and interpret them with wisdom, but to live life, to continue living into the unknown, one must move forward with courage. The leap is the moment where the individual's deepest conscience confronts the universe's silence and says, "I will not be ruled by fear of uncertainty. Instead, I will commit to a path that will sacrifice rational peace for a higher, more intimate form of truth." Truth as lived experience, truth as a relation the person constructs with their own self and with the sacred, however they conceive it. Leaping, Kierkegaard implies, requires a form of faith that is not merely belief in a doctrine, but a decision about how one will inhabit the self in relation to a higher horizon. The risk is not only personal, it is ethical. Choosing a path of faith creates a certain responsibility toward the self and toward others who may be affected by that choice. The conscience, which Kierkegaard calls into play, is the force that shapes a path in a cosmos understood to be open to doubt and danger. When one steps onto the leap, one engages in a process of self-authorship that makes possible a life of integrity, even if that integrity appears as a solitary project in a hostile environment. To illuminate Kierkegaard in a way that connects with heartbreak, consider the way a conscience-creating risk of choosing faith can shape a life after heartbreak. If the heart's wound is not merely pain, but a prompt to reimagine who one is, the leap may become the moment where one asserts a new form of relationship with life. The risk is not just the fear of losing something from the past, but the cost of creating a new self whose commitments may not be easily reconciled with the social world that once understood us differently. This is the existential drama. To accept that the meaning of life may be found in the act of choosing boldly, in the face of a cosmos that does not grant permission, in the face of a community that may misread the new self, in the face of disappointment and possible failure. As with Camus, Kierkegaard's historical context matters. The Copenhagen of the 19th century was a laboratory for the self's struggle against the social order, the state, and the culture's inherited certainties. Kierkegaard used the urban space of a modern city to dramatize the inner crisis of becoming an individual who must decide in the face of uncertainty. He writes as a critic of the crowd, a guardian of subjective importance, a champion of the unique life lived with passion. His dialectical self, always in motion, becomes an exemplar for readers who want to understand how heartbreak can become a catalyst for self-authorship rather than a fuel for despair. This is not to celebrate risk for risk's sake. It is to insist that risk is a necessary condition for the creation of meaning when the obvious sources of meaning, the social consensus, the universal laws of nature, the external verification of purpose, are not readily accessible to the heart's longing. In the experience of Nietzsche, the third pillar, we encounter a different but complementary response to the problem of meaning in a silent universe: the will to live as a creative strain in the face of repetition. Nietzsche's most famous image, the eternal recurrence, asks us to imagine a life that repeats forever: the same joys, the same pains, the same choices, the same heartbreak, the same triumph, yet to affirm that repetition so completely that the idea of change no longer torments the mind. If the cosmos offers no final justification, then the only meaningful way to live is to accept the repetition of life's patterns and to respond to them with a form of love for life itself that refuses nihilistic contempt. Eternal recurrence is not a grim dare, it is a creative challenge. Can you give yourself to a life that repeats without surrendering to despair? Can you find a way to love the very thing that terrorizes you with its obstinate sameness? This is the core of Nietzsche's argument. Life's value is not an external truth handed down by a deity or a universal moral code, but an internal creation of value through vehement affirmation. To say yes to life in the face of repetition is to invent a form of meaning that persists even when the ground seems to shift or vanish. In this sense, the will to live becomes the creative force behind the life one chooses to lead, a force that crafts new interpretations of suffering into forms of resonance, of art, of work, of relationship, and of daily courage. It is not merely resilience, it is a call to transform repetition into resource. The poet of life, the composer of self, learns to hear in the same chords a way to tell a different story, one that makes sense not because the world has become warmer or fairer, but because the person who remains faithful to their own chosen values discovers, again and again, that living itself can be an art. Two vivid examples illuminate these concepts in a way that connects theory to experience. The first is a person who continues to write or compose after heartbreak, laboring under the weight of loss, yet choosing to labor under meaning rather than surrender to despair. The heartbreak is not erased, but it becomes the pressure that shapes the form of the writing, the cadence of the sentences, the melodies, the harmonies. This is not a romance of triumph, it is a practice of craft under duress. The writer sits at the desk, the room silent except for the steady sound of a pen moving or the keys clicking, the heartbeat a metronome that does not forget how to count. The heartbreak changes the vocabulary, yes, but it also clarifies the aim: to tell the truth about what happened, to seek a form in which pain is not merely endured but transfigured into meaning. The act of writing becomes an act of revolt, a deliberate refusal to allow the private wound to become a permanent coda. Camus's philosophy offers a vocabulary for this, not as a reduction of pain into meaning, but as a way of insisting that the only honest response to heartbreak is to keep shaping a life through work, through the craft, through art that can communicate to others who have known heartbreak that they too can endure and create. The second example concerns a musician or artist who crafts art despite repeated rejection and failure, turning pain into form. The artist learns from rejection not to withdraw, but to deepen the communal sense of making. The stage or studio becomes a field in which the artist practices the habit of showing up. Each rehearsal or performance is a new chance to test how the heartbreak of past rejections can become a new voice, a new instrument, a new rhythm. The aesthetic response becomes a life strategy to transform bitterness into beauty, to convert the wound into a piece of music that can connect with others across time and space. In both examples, the heart's ache remains, but the meaning is created by the patient, continuing making, writing, composing, painting, performing, within the constraints of the human condition. This is the central claim. Heartbreak does not have the last word. The last word is the decision to make meaning through effort, through craft, through a life that persists. In moving through these ideas, we must not romanticize the silence of the universe as if it were merely a blank sheet to be filled with bold declarations. The silence is a real constraint. It denies us a ready-made meaning. It challenges us to author our own narratives. It asks us to bear responsibility for the shapes our lives take. Camus offers revolt. Kierkegaard offers faith. Nietzsche offers a radical will that embraces repetition. Each, in his own way, presents a method for living that can respond to heartbreak with integrity, even when the cosmos seems to withhold approval. To deepen the conversation, we must acknowledge counterarguments. One counterargument emphasizes religion and theistic faith as a robust alternative to absurd despair. If God or the gods exist, if a divine order grants coherence to suffering, then the leap may not be a radical risk at all, but a rational step within a larger, intelligible panorama. Theists have argued that faith provides a kind of meaning that the absurd cannot, an ultimate teleology, a cosmic plan, a benevolent author who can be trusted even when the present experience is painful. The critique is not merely about comfort, but about existential adequacy. Do Camus and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, in their different keys, suffice to account for the deepest longings of the heart when faced with heartbreak? The answer for many readers is nuanced. For some, faith is the image of hope that persists in the absence of evidence. For others, faith becomes a form of escape from the raw, unstructured reality of suffering. The tension here is not easily resolved. It requires listening to those who hold a different anthropology of meaning. A second counterargument concerns the claim that meaning is primarily social or relational rather than solitary or interior. The idea that meaning arises through community and care, through relationships, mediated by love, friendship, and shared responsibility, appeals to many readers who see social bonds as the main scaffolding for human life. If meaning is a social achievement, the solitary revolt or solitary leap might appear as a lonesome or even misguided strategy. The critique is not that such a view is false, but that it suggests a different architecture of meaning-making. It invites us to ask, how do Camus, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche account for the social dimension of meaning? Do their arguments allow for a robust place for community, affection, and collaborative creation? Nietzsche, for instance, often writes about the will to power and the creation of value through personal passion, yet his later work also emphasizes the social dimension of culture and the way the individual must negotiate with others to realize a life worth living. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the self is intimately connected to the ways in which the self relates to God, to spouse, to child, and to social institutions. Camus's revolt is not a solitary act of rebellion, but a stance that seeks a form of justice, a social stance against oppression, a stance that has public consequences. To connect these arguments with broader strands of thought, we can point to Stoicism for its insistence on practical serenity. The Stoic project asks not whether life is just, but how one can live well within what is given. The Stoics cultivate a form of quiet resilience that resembles the Camusian revolt in its practicality, even if their conclusion is more about acceptance than rebellion. In Buddhist perspectives on non-attachment, one encounters a different route, the recognition that clinging to fixed outcomes creates suffering, and the practice of non-attachment can lead to a different relationship to heartbreak, one in which pain is acknowledged without becoming a permanent master. The modern therapeutic emphasis on meaning-making, particularly in logotherapy and positive psychology, provides contemporary vocabulary and methods for cultivating meaning in the midst of adversity. Viktor Frankl's claim that he who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow is a powerful synthesis of ancient and modern wisdom. The why, the sense of purpose, can sustain us through even the harshest circumstances. This is not to replace the absurd or the leap with cheerful slogans. Rather, it offers a practical instrument by which individuals can discover or reconstruct purposes that confer direction when the world seems silent. In the connections between theory and practice, we must also embrace the power of quotation and close reading. To compare primary texts, we can place Camus beside Nietzsche on their shared insistence that human beings must create meaning rather than discover it in the world. Camus insists that revolt is a form of fidelity to life, a refusal to surrender to the hollow logic that the universe will somehow reward endurance with cosmic significance. Nietzsche, by contrast, reframes endurance as an act of creative self-making. The will to power becomes the will to live in a way that creates value out of repetition and struggle. Kierkegaard sits between them with the leap that is both ethical and existential, a personal commitment that cannot be proven and may not be publicly validated, but that becomes a ground for a self-conceived life in which the heart continues to beat in the face of doubt. A short scriptural resonance occurs here as well. Camus's words about revolt echo in the ancient Stoic call to arrange one's inner world of opinions and actions, a kind of inner asceticism aimed not at removing pain, but at redirecting its force towards something that can be carried forward. To bring further depth, we can cross-read other strands. The Stoic insistence that we control what we can control, our own judgments, our responses, while leaving the things we cannot influence as they are. The Buddhist emphasis on non-attachment to fixed outcomes, the practice of mindfulness as a way to observe heartbreak without being consumed by it, and the psychological emphasis on meaning, such as Viktor Frankl's logotherapy and Martin Seligman's positive psychology, which argue that a life of meaning, and not solely the absence of pain, is what sustains human flourishing. In a practical sense, these cross-references guide us to a pragmatic toolkit, contemplative exercises that enable readers and listeners to cultivate meaning-making as a habit of life rather than a one-time decision. For those who want to translate these philosophical insights into a living practice, we can propose contemplative exercises. One exercise invites readers to undertake meditative readings of the primary texts, allowing a slow, reflective pace that emphasizes the mood, tone, and structure of the original argument. The aim is not to extract a single thesis, but to inhabit the atmosphere of the argument, the way Camus frames revolt, the way Kierkegaard frames the leap, the way Nietzsche frames repetition. A second exercise is reflective journaling, to write at length about a moment of heartbreak and to track how the reader's sense of meaning evolves as the writing changes shape. A third exercise invites slow-paced dialogue prompts. 2 or 3 questions that pair with a companion to explore how the three thinkers would respond to the same example of heartbreak and what a synthesis might look like. In a sense, these contemplative activities are the new rituals of meaning-making for the modern person who wants to stay alive under conditions of existential pressure. We should pause again to anchor the historical texture and to offer 2 anecdotes that ground theory in lived life. The first anecdote concerns Camus's Algeria years and the public intellectual's role during a moment of colonial politics and existential questions. Camus lived in a milieu where moral claims about justice, freedom, and responsibility had to be reconciled with political realities that could easily appear indifferent to human suffering. He did not simply argue that life is absurd and leave it at that. He argued that the moral life requires a courageous posture even when a political landscape seems to collapse any neat, universal truth. The second anecdote concerns Kierkegaard's dialectical self in 19th-century Copenhagen. Kierkegaard's notebooks and sermons reveal a life spent in a self that is perpetually negotiating the tension between inward commitment and outward social expectation. The social world that fails to understand the solitary inner life becomes a testing ground for how one's ultimate commitments can be sustained. A third anecdote concerns Nietzsche's late works and the idea of embracing struggle. In the twilight years of his career, Nietzsche pressed the case that joy and suffering are interwoven in a form of life that invites the self to revalue every value and to construct a life that can meet repeated trials with vigor. The early 20th century existentialists who engaged with the aftermath of war, Sartre, Heidegger, and Camus again, will be mentioned as part of the broader conversation. These anecdotes show that the absurd, the leap, and the will to live are not simply theoretical issues. They are questions that have shaped intellectual, political, and artistic life across decades and cultures. With an eye toward the long arc of thought, let us now gather a few quotes from primary sources that illuminate the conversation in compact, memorable form. Camus writes that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. The idea that the struggle itself suffices to fill the heart makes revolt not a strategy for victory, but a way of living with the truth of one's own condition. And then, with a twist that has become emblematic of Camus, he adds the call to imagine Sisyphus happy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The phrase makes a moral claim about happiness as a result of fidelity to one's chosen task, not a mere emotional state. Nietzsche's line, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," offers a counterpoint to Camus's emphasis on revolt, a philosophy that interprets hardship as a forge for resilience and growth, a form of virtue in which pain becomes wind in the sails of the will to live. The existentialist leap, though not always cast in exact phrases, takes shape in Kierkegaard's famous line, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." The paradox here is a blueprint for living with memory and hope while still walking into an uncertain future. Kierkegaard's belief that subjectivity is truth, or at least that truth is found in how we live, offers a counterpoint to the other two, an insistence that meaning is not primarily a universal law but a life-constructed coherence, a story one inhabits with personal authenticity. We also want to weave a few more primary voices into the conversation, not only to qualify but to enrich. Marcus Aurelius provides a Stoic complement to the discussion with a crisp, practical sentiment. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. The Stoic exhortation to live in accordance with virtue and reason acts as a counterpoint to the more metaphysical risk-taking of the leap and the existential courage of revolt. The Buddhist voice, though historical texts are far away in distance and tradition, offers a parallel. The principle that all conditioned things are impermanent can be read as a reminder not to cling to a fixed meaning that the universe cannot supply, and instead to cultivate a stance of mindful acceptance and gentle resilience. The modern therapeutic voice, most clearly in Viktor Frankl, reminds us that meaning can be reimagined through purpose. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. These cross-references do not neutralize the differences among Camus, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. They supplement them, offering practicalizations of existential insights for a world that requires more than abstract reflection. To further ground this exploration, a few contemporary examples can illustrate how these ideas manifest today. Consider, again, a writer who, after heartbreak, continues to write not as a way to pretend that the wound never happened, but as a way to articulate its truth, to test new forms of language, to reach readers who might be facing their own heartbreak. In this example, the writer's practice is a Camusian revolt, a daily refusal to surrender to despair, a daily willingness to labor at the craft that can give shape to meaning even in a quiet room where the world seems still and unsympathetic. The second example concerns a musician who continues to compose in the face of repeated rejection, audiences that fail to respond, critics who deny merit, a market that does not always reward risk. In the studio or on the stage, the artist harnesses the pain to fuel a new rhythm, a new motif, a new voice that can speak to the solitary heart while still inviting others into the shared experience of creation. In both cases, heartbreak becomes the raw material for a form of meaning that is personal and yet recognizably human in its call to others. We should also consider the modern interpretations of these thinkers. In the 21st century, Camus has often been read as a radical advocate for moral clarity in a political world that can be both confusing and dangerous. His insistence on revolt gives a framework for political engagement that refuses to bow to either cynicism or apathy. Kierkegaard in the modern era has become a symbol for the internal life of faith, a reminder that personal commitment and authenticity may require a leap that cannot be fully justified by external evidence. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence has been reinterpreted as a challenge not only to endure, but to design a life that one would willingly live again and again, a spiritual geometry of life, a test of whether one can construct a life that is worth repeating. Contemporary existential thinkers continue to ask what these positions look like when faced with digital culture, climate crisis, geopolitical upheaval, and the psychological toll of long-term societal stress. The core question remains unchanged. How shall we live, given a cosmos that does not grant us an obvious meaning, given heartbreak that keeps injecting doubt into our days? To offer practical guidance for those who want to explore these questions in their own lives, we can propose a few structured exercises that invite slow, careful engagement. First, a contemplative reading practice. Select a few passages from Camus, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche and read them aloud, not to memorize arguments, but to inhabit their tempo and mood. Pay attention to the way the sentences pace the mind, the shifts in tone, the pauses that allow ideas to settle. Then reflect in a journal about how the text speaks to your own heartbreak. What is the knot of meaning you are trying to untie? Where do you feel moved to revolt, leap, or affirm? Second, a contemplative journaling exercise. Write about a moment of heartbreak as if you were Sisyphus. Describe the hill, the stone, the rhythm of effort, and your decision to start anew after each fall. Third, a slow-paced dialogue prompt. Two people, one who emphasizes revolt, the other who emphasizes leap, talk about a hypothetical heartbreak scenario, such as losing a long-held dream. The first argues for continuing labor within the problem of meaning. The second argues for a radical commitment that redefines what counts as a life well lived. What would a synthesis look like? What would be sacrificed? What would be gained? We should also provide cross-references to other lines of thought that help to test, broaden, and nuance the discussion. The Stoics offer practical serenity, not to change the events themselves, but to adjust our judgments about them. The Buddhists offer a path of non-attachment that can appear as a form of quiet acceptance. However, the Buddhist path is not about cynicism or resignation, but about the cultivation of a wise and compassionate relationship to suffering. The therapeutic tradition adds a modern dimension by arguing for the centrality of meaning in human flourishing. Viktor Frankl's remark about the why of life, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how," provides a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary clinical practice. The positive psychology movement emphasizes that meaning, hope, purpose, and related constructs contribute to well-being and resilience. Together, they offer a spectrum of responses to heartbreak that can deepen our understanding of Camus, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, while also providing practical avenues for living in the world we inhabit. As we approach the end of this section, we should remember a few essential points. The absurd for Camus is not the final word, revolt is. The leap of faith for Kierkegaard is a personal commitment that cannot be proven but must be chosen. The eternal recurrence for Nietzsche is a call to affirm life as it is, to embrace repetition as a form of act and form of courage. Each voice speaks to a different nerve of human life. The nerve of collective justice and revolt against oppression, the nerve of personal accountability and the courage to choose in the face of uncertainty, the nerve of creative resilience that refuses to surrender to nihilism when pain repeats itself. The wind that blows through each of these arguments is the same cruelty and tenderness at once. Heartbreak is real, and meaning must be made. Let us now listen to a few more brief anchors from the primary sources as a final set of signposts. From Camus, the struggle toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, and one must imagine Sisyphus happy. From Nietzsche, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. from Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards, and a possible nod to Kierkegaard's broader sense of truth in life. Subjectivity is truth, from Marcus Aurelius. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one, from the Buddhist tradition. All conditioned things are impermanent, and from Viktor Frankl, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. The interplay of these lines, intersecting with the modern clinical and psychological frameworks, helps us to see that the problem of meaning in a silent universe is not resolved by any single doctrine. It is addressed by a spectrum of strategies that invite different kinds of courage, different kinds of fidelity to life, and different paths to living in a world that does not provide a final guarantee. To summarize and to invite you into the next part of our exploration, heartbreak in the modern world demands more than sorrow. It asks for a form of philosophical resilience that can turn personal pain into a resource for living. Camus invites us to revolt by continuing to ascend the hill, not by expecting the hilltop to be different, but by insisting that the ascent itself is meaningful. Kierkegaard invites us to risk the self by making a leap that brings us into a relation with life and the sacred that might be denied by the crowd. Nietzsche invites us to affirm life by revaluing all values and embracing repetition as a source of strength and creative opportunity. The two concrete cases, writing after heartbreak and crafting art after rejection, show that these ideas translate into real life when we decide to keep showing up, to keep shaping, and to keep telling the truth through the work of our hands. If you are listening and you carry heartbreak, you are not alone in this inquiry. The absurd is not a condemnation. It is a challenge to reframe the way we source meaning. The leap is not a mere escape hatch from pain. It is a serious decision about what to live for. The will to live is not a cure for sorrow, but a discipline. The discipline of turning pain into form, of choosing to live meaningfully, even when the world offers only a partial answer to our questions. In that sense, the silent universe becomes a theater for human courage, a place where our choices carry the most weight and where our work, whether it be writing, music, teaching, healing, or making, constitutes the semblance of a life worth living. Now, as we move into the next section of the video, we will look more closely at how some modern interpreters have reimagined these ideas for a digital, global audience. We will examine examples from contemporary literature, cinema, and music that echo Camus, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, and we will consider how technology and social change alter the way in which the absurd is experienced and the leap is enacted. We will also return to the two vivid examples of heartbreak transformed into labor and form, and we will ask how those stories illuminate the philosophical questions we have explored. Finally, we will offer concrete exercises for you to practice in your own life, so that the meaning you discover is not a momentary sensation, but a lasting orientation toward living well in a universe that does not hand you a final map. This is the heart of the section, to carry forward the burden of heartbreak with a method, a craft, and a form of hope that does not pretend the silence is easy or that the ascent is simple, but that makes the ascent itself a meaningful act. It invites us to listen for the voices of Camus, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, not as distant authorities, but as companions in the task of living a life that remains human in the face of the hard facts of existence. If we can hold that together, the revolt, the leap, the repetition, we may find that heartbreak does not simply end in despair, but becomes a catalyst for new forms of meaning, new ways of living, and new modes of loving. And so we step forward with the quiet courage that this kind of philosophy asks for, with the patient fidelity to the life we choose to live, and with the belief that, in the stillness of the universe, our own voices and our own crafts can still find a way to respond. Let us begin with a quiet invitation to a terrain that feels intimate and vast at once, the territory where time, memory, and death meet. It is a landscape that philosophers have mapped with diagrams and footnotes, but also with the tremor of a human heartbeat when faced with the end of a life. In the early to mid-20th century, Martin Heidegger stood at a crossroads where philosophy stops explaining the world and starts asking what it means to live in the shadow of finitude. His phrase "being toward death" is not a sensational cry about morbidity, but a technical description of a stance a human being can adopt, to orient oneself toward the fact that death is not merely an event that happens to us, but the horizon within which all possibilities for a life are defined, limited, and finally chosen. To be human is, in part, to be aware that your day-to-day plans, your loves, your ambitions, your failures, and your small rebellions are all threaded through with mortality. When you really see death as a real possibility, not just as a distant rumor, but as the absolute limit of your existence, the possibilities of living change their character. They stop being endless inventory and they become precious, scarce, and urgent. Heidegger does not preach doom. He offers a different energy to the living, not a denial of fear, but a reconfiguration of it. If death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein, then life is not a test that ends in annihilation, but a project of care that can be carried forward only within the truth that time is finite. The ordinary world tends to anesthetize us with routine, with the hum of clocks and schedules, with the social scripts that tell us what a successful life looks like. But being toward death asks us to pause at the threshold of our day and ask, what would matter if I knew this day might be my last? What would I choose to defend, cultivate, or release? The act of asking these questions reorients one's energy away from fear as a paralysis and toward fear as a compass. It is a paradox. The more we acknowledge the fragility of life, the more we may discover a certain intensity of living, an authenticity that doesn't pretend to know the future but commits to the present with a heightened seriousness. To inhabit being toward death is to see how finitude structures authentic possibilities. Heidegger is not suggesting a morbid fixation on the end as such. He is pointing to the way finitude reframes our options. In ordinary life, many of our choices get crowded out by the momentum of habit and the fear of social judgment. The death awareness breaks that crowding. It makes space for decisions that align more closely with what we truly value, even if those choices carry risks. It is a technology of meaning, not a prescription to live in fear, but a discipline that clarifies what counts when the lights go down. Consider how this shifts the planning of a life. A young person might realize that the choice to pursue a seemingly impractical vocation, art, activism, or a radically honest relationship, becomes less reckless and more courageous precisely because the horizon is finite. An aging person might decide that certain compromises no longer serve a sense of integrity, and that saying no to what is not essential becomes a form of freedom. The point is not to fear death more, but to invite death into the room as a constant companion that sharpens perception and clarifies intention. The historical moment in which Heidegger wrote these meditations matters, and it matters deeply. The upheavals of mid-20th century Europe, war, occupation, exile, the tremors of totalitarianism, and the moral reckoning after catastrophe, pressed philosophers to confront the most fragile aspects of life with urgency. Heidegger himself moved through a spectrum of public and private crises, integrating intense ethical conflict with a philosophical program that insisted on a return to the question of being. The disruption of predictable social orders forced a reckoning. If time is our most intimate possession, what happens to a life when the music of history suddenly changes key? The answer he gestures toward is both austere and humane. Mortality does not simply end us. It invites us to undertake our lives with an austere fidelity to what matters, a fidelity that acknowledges that the very act of choosing is a form of creation. Now let us turn to Viktor Frankl, a companion guide who testifies to a different way of living with the same horizon. Frankl sits at the edge of a different crucible, the concentration camps of the Second World War, where human beings are tested not only by deprivation, but by the moral weather of extreme suffering. In his account of logotherapy, Frankl refuses the premise that pain determines meaning. Instead, he insists that meaning is something one discovers or creates through responsible action, even amid suffering. He writes with a force that feels almost serene, a calm conviction that even in the harshest circumstances, life can be carried forward through a decision of the will. He famously unsettles the idea that suffering opinions alone can define a life. The crucial claim is that the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. This is not a denial of pain, it is a claim about the ontological liberty of the human interior. It is also a reminder that meaning is not a prepackaged commodity offered by life. It is a task one undertakes, a work one undertakes in the world that can redeem hardship by binding it to responsibility toward others, toward a cause, toward a project that exceeds the self. The core of Frankl's intervention is the resilience of intentionality. Meaning is not simply found in external successes or even in comfort. It is found where a person is willing to invest significance in something beyond their own immediate craving. Frankl's vocabulary, will to meaning, responsibility, and a purposeful choice, frames death not as a cosmic punchline, but as a boundary that can intensify the moral and existential texture of action. When we face the threat of loss in any form, we can still choose a stance that makes a difference not merely in our own heart, but in the lives of others. There is a profound close reading to be done here. How does a life come to be shaped by the threat of the end? How does the presence of death reconfigure daily decisions, even in small, almost trivial acts? Frankl invites us to attend to those acts, the mundane rituals, the duties we fulfill toward others, the commitments we keep or renegotiate, as the locus where meaning takes root. To appreciate the interplay of these ideas, consider the way memory enters into the shaping of meaning. We have spoken of the future as a horizon that makes possible choices. Memory in a different key is the archive that gives texture, counterbalance, and depth to those choices as they unfold. If death sets a boundary, memory frames the life within that boundary by means of a narrative that grants coherence to the scattered moments we live. Ricoeur's thought helps us see how memory is not a passive archive but an active co-creator of who we are in time. Memory can rejoin the past to the present in a way that allows a life to survive its losses, to find a voice after grief, and to imagine a future that continues to owe something to what has been. This is not nostalgia. It is a principled engagement with the past, aware that memory can heal and memory can haunt, can illuminate and distort, can steady the gaze of the mind while also winnowing away the illusions that time tends to produce. Let us now pause and return to a pair of concrete, intimate situations that make these ideas alive. The first is a family story, a death in the family, and the ongoing process of memory that follows. The second is a clinical or educational scene, a patient or student facing a terminal diagnosis and the life-affirming responses that shape daily choices. In both cases, the questions of mortality, memory, and meaning do not simply hover as abstract concerns. They become the weather in which ordinary days are navigated, the gravity behind every ordinary decision. Imagine the death of a beloved family member, a parent, a sibling, a partner, whose existence has formed the scaffolding of daily life. The room you walk into after the funeral feels hollow in a way that seems almost physical. The air carries a chill that did not exist the day before. The first days and weeks blur into a sequence of tasks, funeral arrangements, the sorting of belongings, the calls to relatives, the helps and the silences, but something within shifts permanently. The sense that time has widened. You begin to notice that a certain kind of object in the home, a familiar chair, a framed photograph, a scent that used to announce a shared evening, now carries a weight that feels almost sacramental. These things stop being mere things and become vessels of memory, trained to evoke a particular past and to demand a particular future. A future in which that person is not present in the body but continues to live through the memories they left behind, through the way their words echo in your own voice, through the habits you carry forward because they once mattered to them. Here the work of Ricoeur becomes especially vivid. Memory is not just a catalogue of events but a living work that makes sense of time by weaving together past, present, and future into a story that endures. The memory of a person who has died is not a static photograph to be revisited. It is a dynamic narrative that can be told anew in each act of remembering, in each retelling to children or grandchildren, in the rituals that punctuate anniversaries, in the way we decide which stories to keep alive and which to let fade away. The memory of the deceased does not simply resurface. It is refigured through the questions we carry forward. What did this person teach me about courage, about patience, about mercy? How did their life shape the kind of person I want to become? And what are the ways we honor their life that do not trap the present in nostalgia, but help us to sustain the ground of our own values? This is where the tension often appears. Memory can be a healing verb or a heavy noun that tethers the living to the past. The danger is a memory that refuses to let the present evolve, that romanticizes the past to such a degree that it becomes a cage. The counterweight to that is a memory that, while still saturated with feeling and longing, remains a source of guidance for action in the present. In Frankl's terms, meaning in this context often resides in a responsible continuation, the choice to live experiences as meaningful even when the sources of meaning have vanished in the physical sense. The memory of a loved one can become a spur to acts of generosity, to the defense of what mattered to them, to the creative continuation of their good work in the world. If the memory wields its power with care, a memory that invites the present to take on the kinds of responsibility the deceased person valued, it becomes a living link between what was and what will be. A second vivid example puts us closer to the pace of daily life in a contemporary setting. A patient or student facing a terminal diagnosis, and how life can still expand its horizon even as its days appear to be limited. A patient enters a hospital room or a clinic with a diagnosis that seems to shrink time to a narrowing corridor. The immediate fear is not just of pain or loss, but of meaning. Will my life retain value if the end is near? Here Frankl's wisdom anchors a clinical and existential practice. There is a zone where the patient can exercise responsibility, even if the only responsibility left is toward a daily routine. The morning routine of getting out of bed, the decision to walk down to the mailbox, the choice to savor a shared meal with a caregiver, or to focus on a project that gives a sense of agency and purpose. The patient does not pretend away the threat of mortality. They transform it by choosing projects that matter to themselves or to others. They might decide to write letters to loved ones, to record stories for younger generations, to complete a task that was abandoned, a garden bed finished, a piece of art completed, a scientific project pursued to its last mile, a teaching moment delivered to a class of students with renewed clarity about what is truly worth learning. In these acts, memory becomes not a passive archive, but a set of resources, skills, relationships, and insights that enable the person to act as if life remains in the center of meaning, even as its outward bounds contract. The clinical example also invites a philosophical turn toward the structure of time in memory and habit. Ricoeur's analysis helps us understand how a life's chronology is not a straight line, but a sequence of overlapping stories. A life told in recollections, in the recollection of others' stories about us, in the ways our own later self-narratives reinterpret earlier events. The terminal patient's days are not merely dwindling units. They are an opportunity to reauthor a personal memoir, to adjust the tempo of daily life, to embrace a rhythm of small rituals that confer dignity and continuity. Consider how memory can be mobilized as an instrument of care. The patient keeps a log of daily activities, a memoir that maps emotional weather across time, a ritual diary that marks whether certain acts brought a sense of peace or a sense of rupture. Such practices mirror Ricoeur's insistence that identity through time is the result of interpretive acts, acts by which one reconciles losses with ongoing commitments and reframes one's future as a space in which meaning can still be planted and tended. Now let us weave these strands with two counterarguments that rightly challenge the optimism, sometimes entailed by the idea that mortality, memory, and meaning can steady the self in the face of finitude. The first counterargument warns that a vigilant focus on death can become a force for nihilism or paralysis rather than action. If life is measured strictly by its proximity to an end, one might retreat into a narrow anxiety, eliminating playful experimentation, risk-taking, or the curiosity that drives innovation. A preoccupation with death can produce an ethics of withdrawal rather than an ethics of courageous engagement. It can turn life into a kind of rehearsal for the inevitable, robbing it of the spontaneous strength that emerges when one acts without an explicit calculus about the final outcome. The second counterargument centers on memory itself as a potentially unstable force. Memory can distort or romanticize the past, turning the historical and personal record into a selectively curated version of events. The past, as Ricoeur warns in his more subtle formulations, is never a pure re-experiencing. It is always filtered through language, through the retellings that fix some elements and neglect others, through the social and political storms that shape which memories endure and which fade. A memory that is too narrow can mislead the present, breeding resentment, guilt, or misplaced gratitude, and can hamper the ability to live fully in the present moment, in the real complexities of day-to-day life. To engage with these counterarguments is not to discredit the beauty of the Being Toward Death project or the passion of logotherapy and memory theory. It is to insist on a more precise, more careful anthropology. We must hold together the intensity of the horizon of finitude with a disciplined attention to the social, historical, and personal contexts that shape how we experience time. We must ask, how does a life survive its own end if memory becomes a weapon of self-deception? How does a person choose meaning without collapsing into a purely defensive posture that merely endures pain? The answer, once more, lies in the convergence of these thinkers and in the daily acts of care that give life its texture. The Stoics, for example, remind us to practice acceptance alongside resilience, to acknowledge the limits of what we can control while cultivating virtue, patience, and calm. The Buddhist tradition invites mindfulness of impermanence, not as a grim march toward extinction, but as a practice of presence, of meeting each moment with an attentive, compassionate awareness. Psychoanalytic insights from Freud and Lacan add another dimension. Grief is a process that can transform attachment, leaving behind not the absence of what is lost, but a new way of relating to it that reorganizes desire, memory, and symbol formation. The aim, then, is not to deny danger or to pretend away memory, but to choreograph a life in which fear, memory, and love are in a dynamic, reflective relation to one another. In keeping with the call for a close reading of primary texts, we should listen to the way these voices speak in their most exact terms, while letting their ideas reverberate through the lived experiences we've just sketched. Heidegger's Being Toward Death invites us to consider death as a structural moment in the field of possibilities. To become aware of death is to learn to distinguish between the inauthentic drift of everyday routines and the authentic tilt toward what truly matters. It is a discipline of attention. In Frankl's view, meaning is not imposed from above by cosmic decree, but discovered in the world through acts of responsibility and choice. Even when suffering cannot be avoided, the way one faces it can be a creative act of moral shaping that lends a sense of purpose to each day. Ricoeur's memory theory introduces a forward-facing humility. We are not merely remembering, we are interpreting, reconstituting, and sometimes revising the past in light of the present and the future. Time, memory, and mortality thus meet in a space where identity is negotiated by narrative and where the present is never simply a bridge between a past and a future. It is a site of meaning-making in its own right. If we were to press for a set of practical methods that bring these theories into everyday life, we would propose a few contemplative exercises designed to sustain a calm, measured cadence even in the face of sorrow or fear. First, a reflective timeline. On a wide sheet of paper or in a journal, you map out major life events, the turning points, the losses, the moments of joy, the decisions that changed the course of your days. You place those events along a line, then you draw arrows to show how memory has resourced those moments as you experienced them and how your present self interprets them now. The aim is not to reconstruct a flawless chronicle, but to notice how memory emphasizes certain motifs, how the future is anticipated, and how death haunts or informs the way you value each moment. Second, memory moccasins journaling, a practice of writing brief entries at the end of each day that answer a few simple prompts. What memory did this day awaken? What meaning did I find or lose? What did I do today that would honor someone I love if they were here to see it? The image of wearing memory as a pair of moccasins, a gentle, grounded thing that you carry with you, invites a tactile sense of memory as something that travels with you into the daily walk of life, not something that is locked away in a drawer. Third, age-appropriate rituals. As time unfolds, we can integrate rituals that honor both the living and the dead. A family ritual around anniversaries, a small ceremony for the birthday of a loved one, a memory box that is revisited with a child or a student to teach the lineage of stories that connect a life to its community. These rituals create a cadence of remembrance that keeps memory from becoming a mere urge or an ache. They transform memory into a practice of belonging. As we contemplate modern interpretations of these ideas, we can see how contemporary thinkers, artists, and ordinary people adapt Heidegger, Frankl, and Ricoeur to new questions about mortality, memory, and time. In a world of rapid information, where time seems to accelerate and where social networks create new shapes of attachment, the question, what matters now, becomes urgent in new ways. The climate of global crises, the rapid pace of technological change, and the persistent fragility of human ties push philosophy toward practical, present-tense ethics. What commitments do we hold in the face of irreversible change? Where do we invest our daily energies when the horizon feels uncertain? The answers that emerge from the synthesis of being toward death, logotherapy, and memory theory point to a life framed by deliberate attention to what is truly significant, a life held together by acts of responsibility toward others, and a memory that remains open to reinterpretation in light of ongoing experience. To deepen the connection with literature and narrative, we return to Tolstoy, whose Death of Ivan Ilyich has long served as a mirror in which readers observe their own time, their own social scripts, and their fear of insignificance. Tolstoy's work probes the social perception of a life nearing its end, the way colleagues, spouses, children, and society judge the quality of a life that has become a problem rather than a triumph. The opening world of social propriety, the judgments of others, the quiet failures in the face of illness, all of these illuminate a human longing for authenticity that surpasses social recognition. The famous line from Tolstoy's broader corpus, that all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, condenses the anxieties and the alienations that can accompany a life lived under the gaze of others. In Ivan Ilyich, we witness a life that is compelled to confront the difference between the social image of success and the intimate truth of personal suffering. The arclight of his dying months exposes not just his own fear, but a social ecology that resists vulnerability, that requires one to perform the role assigned by others, a life suspended between social legitimacy and personal truth. The novel thus becomes not a mere medical case study in mortality, but a moral laboratory in which the shapes of time, the judgments of others, and the eminent questions of meaning converge. When we inhabit Tolstoy's world, we are reminded that the structure of time is not merely a personal matter. It is also a social artifact that can either obscure or reveal the dignity of a human life at the moment when its clock runs loudest. Finally, to thread the threads together with explicit cross-references to other philosophical strands, we can see a continuous conversation across time. Stoicism, with its insistence on the acceptance of what cannot be controlled and the cultivation of virtue as a stable good, supplies a steady hand at the tiller when fear of death threatens to destabilize action. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, contemplating loss to reduce its psychological sting, prefigures Heidegger's call to know the horizon of finitude as a condition of authentic living. Buddhist mindfulness brings a practice of present-centered awareness to the table, a non-judgmental attention that helps us meet the reality of impermanence with gentleness rather than panic. The Buddhist approach to death and dying, with its emphasis on awareness of the impermanent nature of all phenomena, resonates with the way being toward death reframes life as a meaningful project rather than a succession of distractions until the final curtain. Psychoanalytic insights, Freud's work on mourning and melancholia, Lacan's emphasis on symbol formation and desire, offer a language for understanding how grief is processed, how memories become signs and symptoms, and how the mind organizes the past into usable shapes for living in the present. These are not rival doctrines, but a chorus that helps us navigate the same terrain from different vantage points. In this long, slow, careful listening, we have also offered two concrete, practical demonstrations, exercises of reflection that invite disciplined practice rather than abstract speculation. The reflective timeline helps you visualize the arc of your life as a narrative shaped by memory, by intention, and by the awareness of finitude. Memory Moccasins journaling invites you to carry memory forward in daily life, not as a weight to bear, but as a source of guidance and continuity. The rituals, the acts of care, the small duties that honor those who have shaped us, these are the living methods by which philosophy translates into everyday life. The goal is not to become morbid or fearful, but to cultivate a steady, calm cadence that allows for authentic choice in the face of the inexorable truth that time passes and cannot be conjured back. In a channel such as Snooze philosophy, the aim is to help you drift toward a more reflective, more deliberate way of living, a life in which the awareness of mortality deepens your care for what matters, rather than shrinking your days into scarcity. Let us return to the central claim in a final, integrative way. Death, memory, and time are not isolated phenomena. They are intertwined ways of knowing who we are and what we owe to each other. Heidegger's Being Toward Death invites us to posture ourselves toward finitude so that we may reveal the authentic possibilities of living. Frankl's logotherapy teaches us that meaning is a resource we actively mobilize through responsibility and purposeful action, even in circumstances of extreme suffering. Rick Orr's philosophy of memory, history, and forgetting offers a way to see that the past remains present and active because it is interpreted and refigured through the narratives we construct. The Tolstoyan lens gives us a social and literary vantage that reveals how time, status, and perception shape what counts as a life well lived. Across these perspectives, a common practice emerges. The deliberate cultivation of attentiveness to what matters, the careful stewardship of memory, and the daily enactment of responsibility toward others that can transform even the most precarious days into meaningful acts. As you move forward, consider this invitation. Every morning, pause to acknowledge the horizon of your day and the fragility of your plans. Ask what would count as authentically meaningful if you knew this day might be your last. Then follow through with actions that reflect that inquiry, small, steady, compassionate acts that align with your values and with the memory of those who have shaped you. Build a memory in the present that can be revisited with clarity in later years, rather than a memory that demands a painful replay of the past to justify its existence. In doing so, you participate in a long, patient tradition of philosophers and poets and ordinary people who have asked the most human questions. What makes life worth living? How do we bear death without becoming crushed by it? How does memory hold us to the good even when time itself seems to slip away? And so we close this segment with a quiet, hopeful cadence. The inquiry into being toward death, logotherapy, and memory is not a call to bleak resignation, but a discipline of living with more truth, more tenderness, and more intentional care for what truly matters. In the style of this Snooze philosophy journey, may you find in the awareness of finitude a refined freedom. The freedom to choose, in everyday moments, to be more fully present to the lives of others, to be more faithful to the meanings you have chosen, and to cultivate a memory that can bear the weight of time without breaking under its pressure. If you carry these ideas with a patient attention, the horizon, once a source of fear, may become a steady boundary within which the mind can exercise its noblest capacities. To create, to forgive, to remember rightly, and to live with an integrity that makes even the most heartbreakingly ordinary day a small, enduring triumph. Welcome to this portion of our journey through 2 hours of heartbreak philosophy, where we turn a difficult truth into a practice that can anchor us day after day. If your heart is heavy, if the world feels too big to bear and too delicate to trust, you are not alone. Heartbreak arrives not as a single event, but as a current that can reshape the way we move through our days. And yet there is a path in heartbreak, a way to translate theory into practice, to translate sorrow into care, and to translate isolation into small acts of meaning that accumulate into resilience. This section invites you to translate philosophical insights into everyday resilience, practical routines that steady us, social connections that remind us we are not islands, and ethical commitments that widen our responsibility beyond ourselves. Think of it as a map for living with heartbreak with clarity, tenderness, and intention. Let us begin with two core strategies that will guide our exploration. The first is meaning-centered practice drawn from Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, a philosophy of mindset and mission that does not pretend pain disappears, but reframes it as a space in which we can choose how to respond. The second draws from the ethics of care and relational duty, a lineage that includes Simone de Beauvoir's insistence on our embeddedness in others, and especially Nell Nussbaum-inspired considerations about dependency, vulnerability, and love as a basis for obligation. The third strategy centers restorative practices, journaling, slow reading, mindful conversations that invite stillness, receptivity, and the gentle recharging of moral energy. We will deepen these with practical exercises, historical anchors, and critical reflections, so that the insights do not stay abstract but ripple into the texture of daily life. First, imagine for a moment the space between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, who endured grievous deprivation in the camps, insists that even in the most extreme circumstances there remains a space, a margin, a moment in which we can choose how to respond. He did not claim a painless solution, he offered a discipline. Between the sudden news of loss and the next action you take, there is a silent interval in which attitude becomes the thing you own. It is not a denial of pain to claim this space, it is a claim to a form of freedom that suffering cannot erase. And yet this is not a call to buoyant optimism in the face of real sorrow. It is a call to a deliberate stance. We shift from being acted upon by events to acting out of a personal meaning that we still can articulate, even if the words feel fragile. As we begin to craft a structure for meaning, we learn to phrase the question not as "why did this happen to me?" but "what can this situation ask of me now, and what kind of person do I want to become in the wake of this loss?" Let me offer a practical framing from Frankl that we can directly translate into daily life. The core idea is that meaning is something you actively create, not something you passively receive. It begins with a personal mission, a sense of direction that can survive the worst days. You might begin by asking, what is my deepest commitment? What is the work or the relationship that I want to protect or cultivate even when heartbreak feels all-consuming? Then, reframing becomes a habit. If the heartache appears as a closed door, we deliberately shift to seeing it as a doorway into a new kind of responsibility. To be present with another's pain, to repair what can be repaired, to channel sorrow into a form of service or creation. To anchor Frankl's practice in daily life, you can adopt 3 micro-duties that fit into a morning routine, a midday check-in, and an evening reflection. In the morning, write one line that names a personal mission for the day. It could be something intimate like, "Today I will listen without rushing to fix, with a friend who needs to be heard." In the middle of the day, take a deliberate pause to reframe a small annoyance or setback as a choice point. You might tell yourself, "I can endure this setback," or "I can reshape my attitude toward it." And in the evening, review one moment in which you chose a response aligned with your mission and one moment where you felt pulled toward old patterns. The mere act of naming these moments begins to retool your narrative from pain as a trap to pain as a teacher. One of the most tactile ways to operationalize meaning is through journaling as a sustained exercise in meaning-making, complemented by reflective dialogue with a trusted friend or mentor. The habit of journaling alone can help you map your inner landscape, but the addition of a listening partner creates a relational field in which your words can stretch and your accountability can deepen. The practice is not about producing a perfect entry, but about returning to a question with honesty, about inviting a witness to your process, and about testing your meanings in dialogue. A trusted friend or mentor can serve not as a therapist to diagnose your grief, but as a cooperator in your search for meaning. Someone who can help you notice patterns, name false hopes, and hold space for complexity. To illustrate, imagine a sustained exercise in meaning-making that unfolds over 2 weeks. In week 1, you begin with a morning prompt. What is my current mission, given the heartbreak I am carrying? Your entry might describe a specific relationship, a role you hold in the world, or a value you want to protect. You then invite your dialogue partner to respond with a short, open-ended question that reframes your entry. Questions like, what would it mean to act as if this mission is already true in your daily life? Or what is the smallest step you can take today that aligns with your mission? In week 2, you begin to test the statements you have forged. You revisit entries, look for illusions or misdirections, and examine where you have given your energy to rumination rather than action. The aim is not to eliminate sorrow, but to convert it into a clear, durable intention that persists even when the day is difficult. This approach is not a solitary endeavor, it is deeply relational. Simone Weil offers a counterpoint worth listening to in this context. Weil's commitment to service and encounter with the poor is a path that teaches us that meaning is not owned in isolation, but enacted in relation to others. In her insistence that attention is itself a form of generosity, she invites us to listen with a certain moral gravity. When we hear another person in pain, we are not merely offering sympathy. We are practicing a form of ethical attention that acknowledges the other as a being with dignity and a claim on our time, resources, and presence. The words often quoted about Wilde's attention capture a posture. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. It is a discipline that slows us down enough to hear, to resist the impulse to fix, to allow the other's distress to be visible without immediately converting it into our own coping narrative. When heartbreak becomes a practice of care, we widen the circle of meaning to include responsible action toward others, not simply inward relief from our own pain. A second strategy sits in the ethics of care, with a lineage that anchors relational obligation in the reality of dependency, vulnerability, and love. The ethic of care begins not with abstraction but with concrete relationships, the people who bear our names, the people who depend on us, and the people who rely upon our attention. In this frame, heartbreak is reframed as an invitation to strengthen relational bonds and to take responsibility for the well-being of those with whom we share our lives. The moral question shifts from what is my right to feel better to what can I do to support the flourishing of others while also stewarding my own healing. One powerful articulation of this approach is through the recognition of dependency and vulnerability as the site of moral obligation. When we acknowledge our interdependence, we cultivate practices that resist both withdrawal and masochistic self-sacrifice. The aim is to build a network of care in which everyday acts of kindness, empathy, and responsibility accumulate into a living, ethical ecology. A practical extension of care ethics is to cultivate a repertoire of mindful conversations. This is where restorative practices come in, journaling, slow reading, and mindful conversation that invites stillness. The goal is not to race toward resolution, but to cultivate a capacity for bearing witness to pain without immediate judgment or retreat. Slow reading becomes a way to slow time and allow emotions to settle into understanding. It is not about squeezing a philosophical argument into a strict timeline, but about letting the words, their rhythm, their silence, their paradox, wash over the reader, inviting a more patient comprehension of heartbreak. Journaling, you already know, the restorative conversations require a delicate architecture, a space in which your partner holds your vulnerability without offering cliches or quick fixes. The question to your dialogue partner is not, how can I stop feeling this? But rather, what do these feelings invite me to understand about my commitments, my fears, and my capacity for care? Let us name the concrete examples of practice that will bridge theory and daily life. The first is journaling and reflective dialogue with a trusted friend or mentor as a sustained exercise in meaning-making. You can set up a routine where you meet weekly, but you also create smaller daily anchors. Perhaps you begin with a 10-minute journal entry in the morning focusing on meaning and intention for the day, followed by a 20-minute dialogue later in the week where you share a specific entry and invite the other person to reflect back with questions rather than advice. The questions can be simple and precise. What part of my narrative am I missing? Where have I protected myself from a deeper truth rather than naming it? What action would honor my earlier commitment while acknowledging today's pain? The aim is to cultivate a practice of honest dialogue in which the two of you map out the meaning you are seeking and then hold each other to a humane standard for living with heartbreak. The second example involves small acts of service or creative work that channel heartbreak into compassionate action. The logic is simple. Heartbreak can be transformed when we turn toward others in ways that are actionable, measurable, and morally legible. That might mean volunteering a few hours to repair a neighbor's property, or it might mean channeling grief into a creative project, writing, art, music, or poetry that speaks to shared vulnerability. The key is that the act of service or creation does not erase suffering, but it reframes it as energy that can contribute to someone else's well-being. In the act of giving, we discover a reciprocal economy of meaning. What we offer to others returns to us as a form of moral nourishment, a sense that the sorrow has found a social context rather than remaining a private burden. But there are more ways to frame practice that may feel novel, even startling in their beauty and restraint. The third example is the Jose-like act of repair through kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, a visible mending that honors the break rather than disguising it. This is not merely aesthetic, it is a philosophy of life. The cracks tell a story of fracture and resilience. The gold used to fill those cracks makes the fracture more beautiful and durable than the original piece. When heartbreak enters, we can approach our own lives as vessels that can be repaired through mindful care, patience, and creative attention. The mending becomes an ethic. It does not erase loss but dignifies it, turning fragility into a strength that holds together a larger whole. The practice invites you to collect the broken pieces of your days and with patient hands, imagine a new pattern, one that respects the history of the hurt and invites the light to pass through the repaired surface in a way that reveals more than before. A fourth example leans on routines as a technology for grief. This routines-based approach to grief emphasizes daily presence, consistent rituals, and deliberate repetition that gradually reweaves a sense of stability into life. Grief is not a break that must be bridged with sudden leaps. It is a process that can be supported by the regularity of morning and evening routines, by small rituals that anchor the body and the mind, and by the conscious inclusion of rest, nourishment, and social touch. The schedule matters not as a prison but as a friend. It is in the rhythm of daily life that the heart can learn to carry sorrow without being overwhelmed by it. You might create a ritual for days when the weight feels especially heavy, perhaps a short walk at a fixed time, a ritual of tea or tea light, a short note to someone you love, a moment of breath counting, a ritual of lighting a candle to remember what you care about. These practices do not fix heartbreak, but they hold space for it so that you can move through it with less fragmentation. To ground these practices in lived history, let us consider two powerful vignettes. The first is Viktor Frankl's account of logotherapy in the face of extreme deprivation. It is not a mere sermon about attitude, it is a testimony to human agency under pressure. Frankl describes small acts of meaning, choosing to maintain dignity, choosing to care for others in the camps, choosing to preserve a memory of love, as acts that endure even when most of life collapses. The second is Simone Weil's life of service and encounter with the poor. Weil did not seek self-fulfillment by escaping pain. She sought to meet pain through the act of giving and through attention to those who must live on the margins. She suggests that meaning is not a private possession but a relational practice, an ongoing discipline of giving attention, which is a form of moral labor that can reframe the self in the presence of the other. And beyond these two figures, there is a broader tradition, the care ethics that emerged in late 20th century philosophy, and that has since become a central lens for thinking about accountability, vulnerability, and social obligation. This tradition asks us to look at the infrastructures of care, the people, networks, and institutions that sustain others, and to see heartbreak not only as an individual ailment, but as something that reveals gaps in our shared humanity. If we turn to concrete philosophical reflections and their implications for daily life, two counterarguments deserve careful attention. First, there is a risk of oversimplifying grief into a formula or technique. When we reduce heartbreak to a set of steps, journal daily, reframe attitude, perform acts of meaning, we risk pathologizing authentic sorrow or turning sorrow into a project rather than a genuine experience. Grief is not a problem to be solved, it is a territory to be traversed. The danger is evident when the technique becomes a cage that feels obligatory, a standard by which you must measure your own pain or that of others, which can lead to a sense of failure when emotion wells up beyond the method's reach. The antidote is to keep open the possibility that the technique serves as a scaffold rather than a cage, and to allow the emotional landscape to exceed the script by continually inviting the other in, including the person who is suffering in your own life, and learning from that suffering rather than weaponizing it for personal gain. A second counterargument is the danger of ignoring systemic causes of heartbreak in favor of individualized coping. It is easy to tell someone to cultivate meaning, practice care, and engage in restorative routines, but heartbreak is frequently entangled in structural forces, economic insecurity, political instability, social marginalization, and violence. If we insist that resilience rests entirely on personal practice, we risk obscuring those larger causes and blaming individuals for their vulnerability. The response to this critique is not to abandon personal practice, but to situate it within a social framework. To recognize that healing rights and meaning-making must be supported by communities and institutions that reduce the sources of heartbreak and by political action that addresses structural inequalities. In other words, we can hold both strands together, the interior work of meaning-making and the exterior work of collective care and social reform. A third counterargument, sometimes whispered in the margins, is the temptation towards sentimentalism or toxic positivity. The fear is that the insistence on meaning-making and care could pressure people to put on a brave face, to pretend that everything is fine, to avoid naming the real darkness of grief. The remedy is to distinguish between hopeful realism and buoyant denial. The aim is not to erase pain, but to learn how to live with it without becoming subsumed by it. The care ethic helps here by insisting that love for others includes the live truth that we all must face difficult emotions with honesty and without coercive demands to smile. The restorative practices we describe are not about masking grief, but about naming it more clearly, listening to it more carefully, and giving it time and room to speak within a larger fabric of daily life. As you navigate these ideas, you will encounter a web of cross-references that enrich the conversation. Stoic practice, with Epictetus reminding us that men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them, invites you to examine the interpretation that amplifies heartbreak rather than the pain itself. The Stoic path encourages a disciplined, rational mindfulness about what you allow to grow into your self-narrative. In parallel, Buddhist compassion practices invite you to meet suffering with a kind of open presence. Not grasping for relief, but staying present with the other's pain, and with your own, in a way that expands your capacity to respond with skill and care. In contemporary psychology, humanistic approaches remind us to honor the intrinsic dignity of the person we are, to foster self-actualization through empathetic, egalitarian relationships, and to recognize that healing often emerges in the safe spaces created by warm, genuine conversation. In resilience research, think of Bonanno and others, shows that people endure heartbreak not only by bouncing back, but by adjusting, reorganizing, and in some cases, maintaining a kind of flexible, hopeful stance that remains open to new possibilities over time. Throughout this exploration, let us maintain explicit guidance for expansion. The following steps are designed so you can begin right away, then deepen gradually. Step 1 is to set up your 2-week plan. Create a small, non-judgmental space for daily reflection and schedule weekly conversations with a trusted partner. Step 2 is to establish 3 core routines. A meaning-making journaling practice, a slow reading habit to soak ideas rather than to convert them into quick conclusions, and a mindful conversation ritual that prioritizes listening over problem-solving. Step 3 is to build 2 additional layers of practice, a kintsugi-inspired repair practice, and a routines-based grief framework that keeps you present rather than overwhelmed. Step 4 is to articulate 2 or more examples of practice that you can call upon in moments of acute heartbreak. Let me sketch a 2-week plan in the density of a script you could read aloud to yourself. In week 1, you begin by naming meaning. Each morning, you write 1 purposeful sentence about your mission for the day. It could be a sentence about how you will show up for a friend in need, how you will care for your own body, or how you will attend to your own emotional needs with honesty and gentleness. You then pair this sentence with a 1-line reframe for any pain that arises. If you wake with a sense of shattered expectation, your line might be, "I cannot fix what happened, but I can choose the next small step that aligns with my mission." In the evening, you record a brief reflection on where you felt your mission most at risk and where you found a moment of grace, a small act of kindness you performed or witnessed. In week 2, you invite your trusted friend or mentor to listen as you read your morning mission and your evening reflection, and you invite their questions. Their role is not to diagnose you or to provide advice, but to reflect back what they hear. What your patterns are, what you are avoiding, what you are risking as you depart from familiar habits, and what you might try out in the coming days. If a week into the plan you find yourself blocked by a particular mood, you and your partner can craft a one-off exercise for that day, perhaps a shared walk, a co-authored letter you will not send, or a simple act of service toward a neighbor that yields a micro sense of agency. For the journaling and reflective dialogue practice, here are some prompts you can keep handy to shape your conversations and entries. In journaling, you might begin with, "What memory of love or care am I most reluctant to revisit, and what truth does revisiting it hold for my current life?" Or, "What is one daily action that would honor a person I have loved who is not physically present to witness it?" In your dialogue, you might invite questions such as, "What is the easiest truth you are resisting today, and how can naming it liberate you?" Or, if meaning is a shared project, who could join you in this inquiry, and what role could they play? How would you welcome their inquiry in return? The beauty of these prompts is that they are not tricks to bypass sorrow, but instruments to illuminate the texture of meaning that heartbreak can reveal. Let's remember 2 historical anecdotes that ground this approach in lived reality. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy emerges from a harrowing context, the concentration camps, where the insight that meaning can be created even under the most brutal conditions became a lifeline for many. It was not a magical theory that erased pain. It was a practice that allowed a person to preserve something of themselves, their decision, their stance, their memory, their humanity. In his journals and in his books, he speaks of noticing the way a fellow prisoner would imagine a future reunion or a memory of a beloved person, and that memory could sustain dignity in the worst moment. He did not preach an easy solution, but he provided a discipline that empowered people to say yes to life even when it hurt, to say yes to responsibility, and to say yes to the possibility of choosing one attitude that would not be surrendered to despair. Simone Weil, for her part, chose a path of service, even when it demanded great personal risk and sacrifice. She walked into sites of hardship not to analyze from a distance, but to meet need with presence. She reminded us that meaning is not something we hoard. It is something that grows when we encounter others with attention and humility, and when we recognize that caring for the vulnerable is itself a form of moral knowledge, a way of knowing what matters most through the act of giving and receiving care. The broader care ethics tradition that followed in late 20th century philosophy further widens the lens, pushing us to see the social distribution of care as a moral question in its own right, in which institutions, families, workplaces, communities, and states bear responsibility for sustaining the conditions under which people can thrive even in the face of heartbreak. Now, how do we address the possible objections in a way that remains faithful to care and meaning? If we worry about oversimplification, we can insist that the 2-week plan and the journaling dialogue are not universal cures but flexible scaffolds. If you find that your pain resists any sense of meaning for days or weeks, the plan invites you to step into stillness, to practice gentle self-compassion, and to return to the practice as your capacity grows. If you worry about systemic causes, you can integrate a dimension of social critique into your practice. Set aside time for learning about policies that affect vulnerable communities, or join a community group that addresses housing, health care, or education justice. The aim is not to abandon personal healing, but to ensure that your healing also supports and participates in reducing suffering beyond your own doorstep. And to avoid sentimentalism or toxic positivity, we encourage an honest register of emotion. You may speak of sorrow, anger, confusion, or fear, and you may name the moments when you feel carried by love or held by a friend, without demanding that pain be transformed into smiling inevitability. To weave primary sources into the texture of your daily life, here are a few brief, carefully chosen quotes that you can hold as touchstones, each under 90 characters so you can quote them easily in conversation or in your own notes. Epictetus offers a crisp counterweight to false comfort. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. Marcus Aurelius adds a reminder about the cultivation of inner life. The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. Viktor Frankl's own concise echo of agency and hardship is accessible in a single line. Between stimulus and response there is a space. Simone Weil's invitation to generous attention is compact and resonant. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, and a Buddhist reminder, often taught in the form of a universal principle, can anchor the routine in a larger tradition. All compounded things are impermanent. These lines can be spoken aloud to ground a moment of decision, or written in a journal as a reference point when the day grows heavy. As you listen, consider how the cross-references come alive when you juxtapose these figures. The Stoic insistence on shaping your interpretation of events echoes Frankl's insistence that you choose an attitude. The Buddhist call to compassionate presence aligns with Weil's insistence that attention to others is a form of generosity, while the focus on love and care in late 20th century ethics aligns with contemporary resilience research that highlights the social scripts and supports that help people endure adversity. The aim is not to flatten heartbreak into a single technique, but to show how different traditions illuminate complementary pathways toward resilience. If you persist in combining meaning-making with care for others, you begin to cultivate a life in which heartbreak serves as a teacher rather than a tyrant, a life in which the ordinary acts of kindness, reflection, and attention become the scaffolding for a durable sense of self and shared belonging. Before we close this segment, a few practical reminders and a last set of prompts to support you as you write, talk, and create. First, be explicit about your boundaries when engaging in reflective dialogue. You can begin with a permission statement. I want to be honest and careful, so please interrupt me if I begin to blame myself or if I drift toward overly bright optimism. The dialogue is not an arena for self-punishment or for retracting into passivity. It is a space to test your meanings and to invite another person into a shared inquiry. Second, when you practice the kintsugi-inspired repair, name the cracks aloud and celebrate the repair with a symbolic ritual. For example, you can take a moment after you finish mending and say aloud, "This is not a return to the way things were. This is a step toward a new form that can hold more light." The act itself becomes a daily reminder that repair is stronger than the original, that pain tempered by care and craft can become a new anchor in your life. Third, make space for grief as routine, but also as a teacher. The routines-based approach does not ask you to pretend you are cured, it asks you to maintain a steady current of presence. On a day when heartbreak feels like a loud noise in your chest, you might soften your pace with slower meals, longer breath, or a gentle walk without a destination. On a day when you can breathe more openly, you might extend yourself a little longer in conversation with someone you trust or set a small project in motion. A letter you will not send, a painting you will give away to someone who needs it, a bowl of soup for a neighbor you have never met. The point is not to force happiness, but to cultivate a relational rhythm in which sorrow and care are interwoven and given space to develop resilience. Finally, if you would like a condensed 2-week plan you can reuse, here is a simple version you can adapt. Week 1, daily meaning line each morning, a 10-minute journaling entry focused on a single question about meaning, a 20-minute reflective dialogue session with a trusted partner at least once. One small act of service or creative work during the week, a small reminder of a repair ritual, perhaps writing a brief note to your future self about what you learned in that day. Week 2. Deepen the dialogue with more intimate questions. Increase journaling to 2 entries on non-consecutive days. Select 2 different acts of service or creation to weave into your weekly routine. Practice a short kintsugi-inspired repair exercise on an object that holds significance. Incorporate a daily routine that includes a brief pause of stillness and breath to honor presence. And for the final 2 days, review your 2-week arc, note the patterns in your thinking, and plan a longer-term practice that you will sustain. As you finish this segment, let me leave you with a few closing reflections. Heartbreak does not vanish at a single stroke of insight, and it is not a failure to feel pain. It is an invitation to shape your pain into a form that can sustain you and others. The practice is not about erasing sorrow, but about giving sorrow language, space, and a direction that makes your life more available to care, toward yourself and toward others. In this way, the practice of heartbreak becomes a practice of ethics, ethics of meaning, ethics of care, ethics of presence. It is a discipline that grows through repetition, through listening, through repair, and through everyday acts that, when added together, become a durable architecture of resilience. The invitation remains open, to begin now with one small step that is aligned with your deepest commitments, to listen before you speak, to act with kindness before strategy, and to keep returning to the space where you can choose your attitude in your next kind act. To support your expansion beyond this script, here are a few prompts and routines you can adapt as you build your own 2-week plan, and as you widen this practice into a longer journey. Prompts for reflective dialogue. What does this heartbreak reveal about what I value most? Which values have been most challenged, and how can I tend to them with care? What is one memory of love that still speaks to me, and how can I carry that memory without clinging to it? When I say I am hurt, what does this claim actually reveal about my needs for connection, competence, and belonging? How might I imagine a future in which my sorrow becomes a resource for actions that benefit others, rather than something that only weighs me down? And finally, what is the smallest, most actionable thing I can do today to honor someone I've loved, or to repair something in my life that has been broken? Prompts for journaling. Start with a sentence that names your mission for today, and add one sensation you notice in your body as you carry that mission forward. Then write a paragraph about a person you trust who could join you in this inquiry, followed by a short description of how you will invite their help today. After that, write a paragraph identifying a specific act of care you will perform for another person or for your own wounded self, and finish with a sentence that ties the day back to your overarching mission. For restorative reading, choose a slow text on a related theme and read a single page aloud to yourself, paying attention to the rhythm of the sentences and the emotions they evoke. Then in a shorthand note, write what the reading invites you to notice about your own heartbreak and about your capacity to show care. A further 2-week plan emerges from the intersection of theory and practice. The first week can center on meaning-making, journaling, and dialogue. The second week can introduce kintsugi-inspired repair and routines, with both weeks incorporating small acts of service or creative work. You can extend this into a month by varying the acts of care, by rotating your dialogue partners, and by adjusting the pace to your own needs. You can maintain a quiet pace, a careful cadence, and a reverence for your own emotional processes. You can also extend the cross-references of this approach by exploring how Stoic and Buddhist traditions illuminate your practice, how humanistic psychology provides a map for self-actualization within the context of care, and how existentialist ethics invites you to accept a deeper responsibility for how you respond to pain and how you contribute to the world. A final note: as you implement these practices, you may want to collect brief case notes from your own life. The notes can be as short as a sentence a day, or as extended as a 2-page reflection after a crucial moment. If you feel comfortable, you can share these notes with your dialogue partner as a form of mutual accountability and shared meaning. The aim is not to create a perfect record of healing, but to stay with the process long enough for your nervous system to adjust, for your heart to learn its own rhythm, and for your social world to respond to your care with warmth, sympathy, and solidarity. In closing, think of the two core strategies as complementary. The meaning-centered approach gives you a compass, a purpose through which to live your days, even when the heart aches. The ethics of care and the practice of presence offer the relational soil in which that compass can take root and bear fruit. The restorative practices, the journaling, the slow reading, the mindful conversations, provide the gentle, sustainable texture that allows the journey to unfold without burning out your spirit. And the concrete examples, journal dialogue, acts of service, or creative work, kintsugi-like repair, routines-based grief practice, offer tangible entry points you can adopt immediately. The two historical anchors, Frankel and Weil, remind us that meaning is born of responsibility and attention in the presence of others. The broader care ethics tradition reminds us that this responsibility is not merely private, it is a social obligation woven into the fabric of our communities. The counterarguments are not roadblocks, but cautions that help us render practice robust, honest, and ethically grounded. If you want to continue exploring, you can read Epictetus for the discipline of interpretation, Marcus Aurelius for the care of inner life, and the Buddhist tradition for compassionate presence. And you can connect with contemporary resilience research to understand how social support, routine, and purposeful activity correlate with mental health outcomes in the long term. The goal is not to pretend heartbreak is immediately solvable, but to cultivate a durable practice that can sustain you through suffering and toward a life that remains open to care, connection, and meaning. This in turn makes heartbreak not a punishment but a passage that you traverse with others, with care, and with a renewed commitment to be present for the little acts of goodness that carry a life forward. If you found a seed here, if one sentence, one practice, or one question has touched your attention, let that seed take root. In the quiet of your daily life, let your routines become rituals of presence. Let your conversations become laboratories of understanding. Let your acts of repair become testimonies to resilience. And let your heart learn that care, in its most courageous forms, can survive heartbreak and continue to make room for something new to be born in you and through you.